Thank you very much. So I'm just going to take a moment to stare at all of you and bask in this particular moment, because on Tuesday evening at the reception, I referred to you all as a very tough crowd. I was trying to get your attention, but we were at the reception, and I was competing with sumptuous edibles and overflowing libations. So I'm really glad I have you now as a captive audience. I really wanted to start off by talking about how, when I was asked to moderate this panel, I panicked. And I panicked because I didn't feel like I'm the right person to have this conversation, to moderate anything around policies, because I really fixated on the word policy, transparency, and accountability, because I feel that they are words that don't really have any meaning anymore. And I have to confess that despite being a lawyer, when I hear the word policy, regulations, I get irritated, because in my day job, I run a small fund that funds grassroots social justice organizations globally. When you hear of policies and regulations, these are meaningless to the communities that we are supposed to serve. When you think about transparency and accountability, again, these seem to be meaningless towards the communities we serve. And, it's accountability and transparency to who? And Rachel Mwikali of Pussy Power yesterday, made reference to this during the plenary session on strengthening agency and building people power, when she asked, how do we hold funders accountable? So maybe I'm just an irritated individual in general, but I really hope that this panel here will enable us to unpack this. And as we focus today on policies, on Tuesday we discussed practices, the practice dimension of philanthropy. Yesterday we focused on people and power, and today we'll talk about the policies dimension. And I'm just going to refer to, which has already been mentioned, that this policies dimension refers to the regulatory and institutional frameworks that shape the sector, including laws, regulations, governance, and structures. So an inflection point in this dimension is the increasing importance and recognition of transparency and accountability in philanthropy. So, philanthropic institutions are, increasingly being asked now to be transparent about the activities and impact and be accountable to stakeholders. And of course, I go back to who are the stakeholders and who are we being accountable to. This is a very esteemed and eclectic panel, and they're a very well-accomplished group. They come from diverse areas of practice and experience, and I'm looking forward to their contribution. I'll go ahead and make an introduction of them, give you a little small synopsis of who they are, what it is they do, and then I'll hand it over to them. So Professor Jibril Fall is a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics and the director of GK Partners, which implements international development cooperation programs. He's also the African Union lead consultant on diaspora and innovative finance. Additionally, he's a member of the advisory council of the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Program. He's also an international consultant to several governments and development institutions around the world. Nyeleti Onwana is with the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. She's a philanthropic professional working at the nexus of youth, race, and academia. At the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, she directs the African Fellow Awards. She's a co-founder of Global Black Youth, an organization that convenes innovative, disruptive, and entrepreneurial young Black leaders to generate knowledge and solutions to global challenges. She also serves on the steering committee of the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group and co-leads the Africa Peace and Security Network. Shiek Guye, with Alternative Report on Africa, is the head of strategy and foresight at IPR and has worked as a researcher on the links between religions, territories and identities, development issues, climate change, globalization, relations between state and societies. So creating an enabling environment encompasses what policies and practices we have, but enable us to work in a way that is transparent and accountable. And so I'll start off by asking each of the panelists to give a brief description of the work that their organization does and their experience with accountability and transparency. Thank you. We'll start with you, Jibril.
Thank you very much, Chairno, and good morning to everyone. My honor. Thank you very much, Chairno, and good morning to everyone. Perhaps the relevant institution I should mention the work I'm doing is the work I'm doing for the African Union on diaspora and innovative finance. I don't know whether you want me to go ahead and, okay. For the purposes of this discussion, I would give a brief outline of the typology we developed in 2018-19 to describe and understand the nature of diaspora finance. In this field, and many other fields in development, practice is way ahead of policy. As such, on the guidance of this conference of the 4 Ps, I would start with practice, power, people, then policy last. So what is the practice of diaspora finance? There are 4 main sources of diaspora finance, some better known than others. I'll start with the least known. That's diaspora portfolio investment, where members of the diaspora send money and invest in regulated structures like treasury bonds and bills. Second, diaspora direct investment, where diaspora send money to be involved in businesses that they are active participants in. Third, this is the best known of all, is diaspora or migrant remittances. Broadly speaking, it's members of the diaspora sending money to family, friends, and people they know. And the last bit is diaspora philanthropy, where members of the diaspora send money for the benefit of people they do not know. Now, on diaspora remittances, 2022, for Africa, it was about 100 billion. Half of it to North Africa, half of it in sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa, biggest recipient, Egypt. Sub-Saharan Africa, biggest recipient, Nigeria. But a small country like mine, the Gambia, remittances represent about 30% of GDP. So Gambia is the most dependent per capita on remittances in all of Africa. With that volume, we know, I would not say that remittances should be classified as philanthropy, because it is support of family and friends. But we have studied the data, and we can find that there's a good percentage of remittances that is going to people we do not know. And it happens in 2 formats. One is collective remittances, where we contribute because friends and colleagues have told us there's something going on. We contribute for the benefit of people we don't know. And that person who's promoting it is the person remitting it. Second is through diversion. Many years, I would return to Gambia, and I would meet people who would thank me profusely about the monies I've been sending to them. To my utter embarrassment, I don't know them. I've never sent them a penny. But my late mother has been diverting my monies and giving it to them. And many mothers have been doing that across the world. Yeah. That chunk is philanthropy. It is going to people I do not know. But I focus now on debate, which is distinctly and purely philanthropy, going back to the roots of the word, the Latin roots of the word philanthropy, the love of humanity. That is, I send money, I expect no return. I don't even care who gets it. What do we know? We don't know the numbers, but we know the typology. And what format does it take? It goes through the diaspora NGOs, there are not many. It goes through the diaspora hometown and community organizations. That's the biggest group of organizations of diaspora groups. It goes through religious groups. It goes through alumni and professional groups. And it goes through structured trust funds. Some countries have attempted to do this. None of them have been a spectacular success, but they give us a lesson on improvement. Ethiopia tried it with the Ethiopian Diaspora Trust Fund, and perhaps it was Rwanda who pioneered it with Agaciro as a sovereign fund, actually, a state sovereign fund. So that is the practice. Then the power of it. The power dynamic, I think it's healthier than most other philanthropy. But you know what? The diaspora constantly complain that they send money to people who they have no control over. In fact, the people misuse their money. Now, I'm not saying right or wrong. All I'm saying is the power dynamic is a bit more balanced. It's not I'm sending money, and I'm complaining that you're not obeying me. So whereas with other funders and philanthropy, I send you the money to do this. If you don't do it, there would be crisis. Yeah. So that's the power situation. Not that it's good or bad, but it's at least contested at a healthy level. Then we come to people. Who are these people sending money? There are about 45 million on the lower estimate of Africans in the diaspora. About 25 million of them are within Africa. So if we're talking continent-wide, we don't count that 25 because they're part of the African Union. So the 20 million, and this is the African migrants, not the second, third, or the Atlantic diaspora, 40 million African Americans. This is just the Africa-born migrants, about 20 million of them. Now, if you take 45 million migrants, Gambia is always a good place to study migration. It's a small country, big migration. We just did a large-scale study recently, and we asked them, when you receive the monies, you the recipient, by the way, the recipient is not always the owner. So the recipient, how many people does it directly affect? Do you share it with? So we started between 0 to 5. We were wise enough to extend that to 9. Over 65 people said they share it with more than 9 people. That even shocked me. That's a lot. But even if I take a lower number and say each remittance serves about 5 people, then you are talking about 45 million times 5. Yeah? So you're talking of well over 200 million, perhaps over 15% of the African population are directly affected by remittances, and that's the lower estimate. Finally, Ochino, what can we do with policy? Policy is doing hardly anything for diaspora finances. That's a starting point. Can it do a lot? Yes. I'll just give 2 short examples. During COVID in the Gambia, we piloted diaspora development funds. This as a mechanism is recognized, and it's in Objective 19 of the United Nations Global Compact on Migration, which was agreed in 2018. We, between 2020 and 2022, we gave out 400,000 euros through a project, a technical cooperation project I run. The website is called GambianDiaspora.net. GambianDiaspora.net. And on the page on Diaspora Development Fund, we gave 400,000 euros to 52 Gambian diaspora activists. They raised about 4 million euros. For every euro, they would raise 10 euros more. I'll give just one example. When we piloted that during COVID, we gave one Gambian lady who had previously opened a nephrology, a dialysis unit in Gambia. Now COVID have hit. What are the issues? We gave her just 5,000 pounds, and she became the biggest donor of face masks to Gambia, more than WHO, more than JACMA, more than anyone else. She sent to Gambia 1.6 million face masks. Yeah? So Diaspora Development Fund, where you give cash for the diaspora to leverage their networks and resources, I think should be developed. And the second one is around the remittances, where we would create an innovative finance mechanism where remittances are matched by the countries where we live and work and pay taxes. The match is a form of rebate. In America, they have it, tax rebates to charities. In UK, we have it, it's 25%. But the methodology for that, we don't have time to go into this, but it's on the GK Partners website, gkpartners.co.uk, or the African Union website, which gives a framework as to how it would work. These two, amongst other things, are areas of policy that can be developed. And just finally, one which is not directly to the individual migrants, but to the government. The volume of remittances, the regularity of it, the resilience of it, the counter-cyclicality of it, means that it needs to be factored in the sovereign credit rating of countries, so that your rating improves, and that means the cost of borrowing to you is smaller. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good morning. It is still morning. Hi, good morning. I'd like to just start by celebrating once more with you all what a fantastic 2.5 days we've had together. For some of us who came from the academic conference, I'm still on, we've had almost a week together, and it's been so much fun, so exciting, such a creative space. And so I'm so glad to share some of my own insights with you all and continue to learn from my members and panelists here with me. My name is Nyeleti Honwana. I like to introduce myself as an impatient millennial. And I want to talk today, again, as Atieno said, I think not so much about policies, I think we'll get there eventually, but sort of with my own experiences with accountability and transparency through my work at the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. The Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation is based in New York. We are a private operating foundation, and we fund research on conflict and violence around the world. We predominantly fund academics, individual academics, but we also look for commissioned research, make publications, and other very academic-y things, but we are not an institution of higher education. We have a number of competitive grant-making competitions, the first being the Distinguished Scholars Award, which offers up to $95,000 over 2 years to faculty members predominantly. The second competition that we have is the Emerging Scholars Award. That's directed towards PhD students in their final writing year of the PhD, and we offer up to $25,000 for that. The third grant-making competition is the African Fellows Award. It is the award that I run, and I've been running it for about 5 years now. And that specifically offers grant-making and mentorship opportunities over 2 years to scholars based in African institutions carrying out their PhD on some form of conflict or violence that's happening on the African continent. And I think this is where I want to spend the most of my time talking to you all today. I think, and I won't take up too much time, Atieno, but I would like to say just a few things about how we think about accountability and transparency, right? And so I think one of the ways that I approach it is always as sort of an African sitting in an American institution funding African individuals, right, which eventually get back to their institutions and their communities, but looking at the relative power and privilege of those of us who decide who gets money, right? There's so much power in where we sit. And no matter where you sit, I think within, especially these private operating foundations, you can feel like a cog in a machine. But realizing the type of accountability upward and downward that we have, and the power that we have when it comes to building narratives, when it comes to asking questions about why we fund the way we do, what best practices are, why things don't sort of change and evolve, especially given the way that the sector continues to change and evolve. And so that's really been the space in which I've been able to push my African millennial agenda, if you will, in really, as our good sister Hakima said, either I think it was Wednesday, within a sector that was not made for African liberation. And I love that quote, and I'll take it with me, because I think to be a program officer, to be a grant maker, to be deciding who gets funding in various sectors is an incredibly powerful position to be in, and requires the responsibility to be disruptive and to be rule breakers. And so, thank you. And so that is something that I think stepping into that power, right, and being unashamed and unabashed about that is key. And so being part of the conversations that we've had around how African philanthropy is pushing back against some of the best practices that have not always suited us has really been something that I've benefited from over the last several days. And so I'll get into some of the specifics as the conversation continues. But thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous. Je voudrais d'abord saluer tous les frères, sœurs, amis, collègues que j'aperçois dans la salle et me réjouir de les rejoindre en ce dernier jour, en regrettant évidemment de ne pas avoir été là les jours précédents. Je ne sais pas exactement pourquoi on m'a mis dans ce panel. Ibrahim doit savoir, mais je devine que c'est par rapport à l'expérience que j'ai vécue depuis une dizaine d'années, par rapport à tout le dispositif qui a été mis en place par l'État du Sénégal par rapport au fonctionnement des ONG et à leur travail dans ce pays. J'ai travaillé à Enda Tiers-Monde pendant une vingtaine d'années et dans cette période, les accords de siège ont été suspendus brutalement en 2011. Et en même temps que Enda Tiers-Monde, Trust Africa, OSIWA et beaucoup d'autres organisations internationales ont perdu leur accord de siège. Donc on s'est réunis pour demander des comptes à l'État et à partir de ce moment, nous avons été invités à redessiner le dispositif de gouvernance de l'action des ONG au Sénégal. Et donc depuis une dizaine d'années, nous sommes dans un nouveau dispositif avec donc un nouveau décret qui a été mis en place, en tout cas signé par le président de la République actuel, puis d'ailleurs plus récemment encore, en septembre 2022, nous avons également une révision de ce décret. Donc la gouvernance du secteur de la philanthropie concernant en tout cas les ONG et les associations a été un espace, un microcosme, un écosystème dans lequel j'ai évolué donc depuis quelques années. Le Sénégal a toujours été un pays ouvert par rapport aux organisations politiques. Beaucoup le savent, des organisations de résistance en Afrique ont été accueillies très généreusement dans les années 60 et 70. J'étais très heureux en sortant de mon lycée au plateau, de voir les bureaux de Sabni Joma ou encore d'autres organisations palestiniennes qui avaient pignon sur rue. Donc il y avait une tradition d'accueil très importante. Depuis ce qu'on appelle la lutte contre le terrorisme, 2001, beaucoup de ce sentiment d'ouverture, de cet esprit d'ouverture a évolué. Et donc les ONG sont très très contraintes. Aujourd'hui, elles représentent 659 au Sénégal, ONG internationales et nationales. Mais à côté de ces ONG, il y a également 32 000 associations. Des associations qui sont partout au Sénégal, qui travaillent dans tous les domaines et qui reflètent cet esprit, cette culture sénégalaise du don, du contre-don, de l'accès à tous les services à travers des associations, à travers des liens. Ce secteur demande en tout cas, sous ce rapport-là, une très grande organisation, une très bonne organisation. Parce que quand on a fait l'évaluation de ce qu'elles investissent, nous sommes entre 500 et 700 milliards de francs CFA par année. Ce qui représente des sommes que le Sénégal est en train de prévoir dans son budget par rapport à l'exploitation du pétrole et du gaz. Donc ça représente beaucoup d'argent. Mais à côté de cela, nous avons un manque de considération très fort de l'État par rapport à ces ONG et ces associations. Et souvent, ils sont vus comme des gens qui dérangent. Et donc, il y a une relation très difficile entre l'État et ses ONG. Donc, ce que nous essayons de faire, c'est vraiment de faciliter cette relation, de la rendre moins contraignante pour les ONG et pour les aider donc à faire au mieux leur travail. Il m'est arrivé d'intervenir souvent au profit de certaines ONG qui ont reçu des avertissements, qui ont été visités par la police ou par la gendarmerie. Mais l'esprit qui est derrière, en tout cas, tous ces décrets dont j'ai parlé dans mon introduction, c'était de rendre ces ONG plus redevables, de les rendre plus transparentes. Donc on a mis en place tout un ensemble de dispositifs, d'abord pour refaire passer aux ONG l'examen de l'agrément. Donc chacun devrait avoir un nouvel agrément par rapport à son intervention au Sénégal, mais également un programme d'investissement, c'est-à-dire une sorte de contrat entre l'ONG et l'État, qui est co-signé par les responsables de l'ONG et le ministère du Budget, de l'économie et des finances en général. Mais tous ces dispositifs sont très, très, très lourds, très contraignants, et ils le sont de plus en plus. Cela reflète en fait, le manque de considération de tout ce qui relève de la philanthropie, notamment de la philanthropie relative à ces associations et ces ONG, et même également de toutes ces autres organisations. Le Sénégal est un pays qui a un poids religieux très, très important. Il y a beaucoup de générosité dans le cadre du culte, généralement, mais aussi dans la manière de vivre leur religiosité. Et cela s'exprime par la mobilisation de beaucoup de ressources, là aussi, pour financer des mosquées, financer des hôpitaux, des écoles, etc. Mais il n'y a aucun dispositif pour véritablement aider ces organisations. Ça commence à s'ouvrir progressivement. J'espère qu'on vous a présenté un peu la nouvelle loi du WAF, donc cette tendance que l'État du Sénégal commence à mettre en place pour faciliter des investissements qui peuvent survivre à leurs investisseurs et pour lesquels ils espèrent l'agrément divin. C'est ce qu'on appelle le WAF. Donc, mais à part ce dispositif-là, il n'y a aucun autre dispositif pour aider, encadrer ces organisations religieuses pour mieux faire le travail. Donc nous avons globalement une situation très difficile des ONG, que ce soit des ONG nationales ou des ONG internationales. Certaines viennent également des pays arabes. Et donc tout ce dispositif-là a besoin d'être revisité sous l'angle plus positif, évidemment, de la philanthropie à encadrer pour un meilleur profit au bénéfice des populations, en tout cas. Merci.
Thank you all for those. Thank you all for those presentations. I'm going to go to you first, Nyeleti, the impatient millennial. How do you account for accountability towards your grantees?
Is it on? It is on. Okay. Thank you so much, Achenyo. So I think there's a couple of ways that I think about accountability. The first thing I guess I'll say is that being very clear, and I think I need to give a little bit of backstory about the way that this program was actually developed, this African Fellows Program. Essentially, and the director will not be named, this was a passion project of someone who decided that they wanted to support young African scholars. And so by the time I inherited this program about 5 years ago, it had been ongoing for about 10 years before I stepped in. And what I quickly found out after asking some why questions was that there was no intentionality around this programming, right? What I had recognized and what my colleagues at the foundation had recognized is that there were a number of Africanist scholars that we were funding through our Distinguished Scholars and Emerging Scholars competitions. But overwhelmingly, African scholars were applying, but they were not being funded. And so when I was having these conversations with my colleagues, the general consensus was that they were not competitive. And so I started asking questions around, well, why not, right? Question number one. Question number two is, what are we doing in this African Fellows Program to ensure that they are competitive? And so as I started asking some of these questions and realizing that not a lot of thought had been given to how this program was sort of delivering for our grantees, I was a little bit bullish in trying to take this space and deciding that I might try and come up with something different and maybe something that essentially created a pipeline, right? So accountability for me towards my grantees, towards our scholars and fellows, is that if you are currently seen as an emerging scholar and you come into this program, we are saying as the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation that we are going to work with you for 2 years to ensure that you are going to become competitive not only in our grant-making competitions, but in other grant-making competitions, right? So if you get this $10,000 from us, I don't want to see them get another $10,000 grant, right? Get 50, get 100,000, get larger grants, because that is what we owe you, right? So I think it was also just about being incredibly intentional and targeted and strategic. And so often I find that there's not that much thought given to some of these programs, and then we pat ourselves on the back for a job well done, right? But we're not fulfilling the true potential, right, that we could be when we're engaging with them. Another way that I think about accountability is also, what am I doing on the other side? Right, so if I'm sitting in this sort of, seat of power in the microcosm that is New York, when I'm seated and talking to my president, when I'm talking to my board of directors, what is the narrative that I'm pushing about these scholars, right? So we talk so much about assuming agency. I think within academia, it's also so important to assume expertise. And so I say these are young people, these are junior scholars, but they are experts in their field, right? And we need to treat them as such. We need to fund them as such. We need to give them the resources because they are those experts. And so it's telling the different narratives, if you will, right, to those who are not engaging with these scholars in the way that I am. And again, I think that gets back to the power of the program officer. You sit in this sort of middle ground where you're dealing directly with the grantee, and you're also telling that grantee's narrative, right, to the higher up. So when we talk about speaking truth to power, to me, it's discomfort, right? I'm not putting myself in harm's way. I'm not doing anything like that. But so it's incredibly important to be telling fuller stories, fuller narratives about those that we are funding, whether they're individuals or organizations. And if you will allow me, I will just make one observation to this wonderful group that is gathered here. I think, I thought about this quite extensively after we had that wonderful conversation with the minister, the Senegalese minister who visited us, was it yesterday? Wednesday, yesterday. And I do think that, one of the things that struck me and some others as we were talking was the idea that we are talking about transformative philanthropy. We're talking about radical philanthropy in some cases. And so being here in Senegal, in the land of Teranga, where in the last 10 days, we've seen the arrest of an opposition leader, we've seen the disbandment of an entire political party, and we ourselves are dealing with the ramifications of not having internet, right? And we are confronted with someone who is a representative of this government, right? Those of us who are here looking for transformative change, who are interested in supporting social movements, who are interested in supporting media, it seems to me, a missed opportunity to engage, right, with the minister in the way that we really could have. So I wanted to put this to you all and to myself. Let us challenge ourselves to do what we are asking our grantees to do. If they are putting themselves in harm's way, let us not make ourselves shy of being uncomfortable, of creating discomfort.
Thank you very much, Nyaleti. And I love the millennials, I love the young ones who actually come up here and challenge us, especially at these conferences, because lots of times we are all giving ourselves a pat on the back. We talk about the things that we need to do, but when push comes to shove, as Nyaleti said, we should be more aggressive, because we are asking our grantees to do the same. Next question for you is a professor. Your presentation was really, really illuminating. When I had 100 billion was remitted in 2022, that's a lot of money. And you've talked about the fact that you did mention the creation of diaspora development funds. And how do we, as African philanthropy, how do we tap into those kinds of funds?
You don't tap into it, you feed into it. You, the philanthropists, need to bring that sort of blended finance part. And diaspora finance and diaspora finance in general has been sort of the Cinderella in this world, in that it was neglected and people thought wasn't important. But I think in the past 20 years, it's been clear. I'll give you an example of that. When COVID hit, even those of us who work in the field for many years, we all panicked. We believed that the monies will go down because the diaspora and the migrants were losing their jobs. And then Switzerland, United Kingdom, and few others came together and set up a task force on what are we going to do if it collapses by 20%, as the World Bank was telling us it would happen. Of course, theoretically, we'd been saying that diaspora finance and remittances is counter-cyclical. This is the economists thinking, saying it's counter-cyclical. That is, when there's good times, the money will still come in. When there are bad times, when private capital runs, the money will come in. That was the accepted theory, and COVID proved it. not only the remittances not collapsed, in some cases it increased. That's extremely, it's almost like it doesn't make sense. So people in the diaspora, with all of the pressures we're facing, will cut their spending, even incur debts, just to send back. So that primary nature of the strong relationship shows that policy need to really help that area, to leverage, to expand, and to enhance. So the model of these diaspora funds is that institutions like the program we run in Gambia, we're doing that in partnership with the government of Switzerland. They're providing cash. The diaspora have cash, but they have lots more orders, and the one thing they are short of is cash. So bring your cash. They bring a bit of their cash, they bring their technical know-how, they bring lots of orders. And by bringing your cash and your name, it also gives confidence to others who may bring the name. But almost always, then the diaspora you have and giving the money would do things that would amaze you. Because that resilience they have, that innovation is well established. And Ochieno, I'll give you one illustration of why it is important for the philanthropic institutions and international cooperation to take this seriously. Me, I'm a grudging admirer of the capitalist. So I look at the most rampant of them and I see what they're doing, can I learn from them? And they tell us something, the capitalists, about relationship. They said every relationship is based on a hierarchy of loyalty. The lowest is suspect, then prospect, then customer, then client, then partnerships. What I observe is in this world of philanthropy, we take a blanket approach. I give you money, and I regulate you and look for accountability on my populist criteria. To the capitalist, that makes no sense. I should disaggregate and place you where you belong, and I treat you differently. If I am a first applicant, you don't know me, you don't know my credential, treat me as a suspect or a prospect and require a higher degree of monitoring and accountability from me. But if I've been doing my good works before I knew you, you came and you support me in doing it, I've been doing it 20 years. I am a partner at the highest rank of loyalty, and the criteria of accountability should be different. You should not waste your time or my time or resources asking me basic questions. Yeah? So I say the diaspora and their contribution to development, if you were to rank it, it belongs to the top. That is, you can take for granted that these people will do good. Take that for granted. There will be exceptions where crooks and chances and fraudsters would play. But take it for granted that mostly they would do good, and treat them on that basis with generosity and light touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. That really rings true, and actually, what you've described to me is what what in this philanthropic world we've been referring to as trust-based philanthropy. And you've had lots of grassroots groups, community groups who've been doing the work even before the donor came, and they should be trusted because they are doing good work. Next question is for you, Shiek. You've talked about the lack of recognition of NGOs and associations by the state, and wanting to make sure that that relationship and the processes become less cumbersome. Given the current climate, political climate in Senegal, how are you facilitating that relationship in particular, and have you seen it go, deteriorate, just given the current climate right now?
Oui.
Thank you. The paradox is that it is when we had the liberals in power that these constraints relating to registration were at their highest. That is a paradox for me. It is a purely Senegalese paradox. We denounced this a lot. We denounce the ideology of this and that party, but it is at a very superficial level very often. So it is not surprising that in such situations, the politics of the politicians takes the upper hand over a true willingness to collaborate between organizations who put a lot of resources to mobilize financial resources and try to invest it in the most efficient manner possible. The spirit that we have today is a very negative spirit because our authorities put the entire civil society in the same bag. They consider that they are actors who prevent them from doing their work the way they want to do their work, through criticisms or assessments that the civil society do of public policies, etc. So on the one hand, that is the aspect that can maybe explain the stance taken by public authorities with regard to these authorities. But on the other hand, like I said, it is just the politics of politicians. Often they consider that these organizations are much more near support opposition parties or support citizens movements that organize protests such as Yanamar, which highlighted a lot of problems, but also gave a lot of problems to these organizations that provided them with subsidies, because when the state realizes that this or that organization supported Yanama or such types of movements, those organizations were faced with a lot of problems. It's not so, Ibrahima. So it is a genuine problem, really, and I'm not very optimistic like my colleague here sitting next to me, because we can see more and more that with the political stakes with regard to the upcoming elections, and it is because often it's before these elections that these constraints increase, because these are high stakes, high political stakes situations. And currently, despite the new decree that was renegotiated, redrafted with our support, which kind of opened up the space for the NGOs, the practice of the government towards NGOs has remained the same despite that. I'm not very optimistic, really, with regard to whether there will be any change from now to up to 2024. Maybe with a new authorities in power, there will be change. There will be new discussions on the work of these organizations. But we are trying to contributing, especially by producing data on the work that these organizations are doing. We have just published a report, that is the annual report of civil society on public policies, and the idea is to really show in a more documented manner the work that these organizations are performing, and to try to contribute to ensure that the state recognizes them even more and take into account in the public accounts the the resources that are invested by these organizations. And I hope that gradually this information will help to change the situation, because in 3 or 4 days we will be launching this report. We have already had the promise that it will be financed by various organizations, as well as the contribution of the Department of Economic Plan, and I think that is very important, Economic Policies and Planning Division.
Thank you very much, Sheikh, and I should invite you to Kenya and to spend some time with us, because as a population, we are pathologically optimistic no matter what. So I'm going to open this to some questions. We don't have much time. I sat next to Stigmata, who wagged her finger at me about time. So if we can get any questions, a few questions, and we can, towards the panel. There's one over there. So there are 2 questions on the floor. Thanks.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for wonderful presentation. 2 quick follow-up questions to Professor Jibril. Just wanted you to elaborate more on the policy-related articulation to the remittances and charity, the model that you mentioned briefly. I'm very much interested about, and also interested about your work you're doing. If there's any statistic on the diaspora investment in the bond and the direct investment. If there's any statistics, that would be very much interested to me. Thank you.
And then maybe we take the second question, and then there's a third question too, and a fourth.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Good morning. I wanted to thank and commend the speakers for their wise words, but since we're talking about institutional environment, I would also like to commend what our brother Sheikh talked about, but there is also an aspect that we need to talk about. Today there is a decree which allows foundations of public interest to have access to exemptions, but it has to go through an authorization from the Ministry of Finance, and I think there's advocacy work to be done. I saw the list. I saw foundations that no longer exist and that are on that list. I believe that there is some advocacy work to be done, because that also is an important aspect. Today, if Ibrahim as a donor donates to the Sheikh Anta Diop University Foundation, efforts can be made for him to be exempted, to have a tax exemption. I think this is an opportunity that we have to focus on to see how to expand this to other organizations, because with the work that is being done with Trust Africa, foundations are going to be created, and we also are, even with Ibrahima, we are thinking about the idea of putting on place a meeting on Senegalese philanthropy, so that we can develop it before going to the international level.
Then we'll go over to the panel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panelists for the interesting conversations. My name is Titimizi from Urgent Action Fund Africa. Urgent Action Fund Africa provides rapid response grant making to African women human rights defenders. And my question is to Nyeleti first, to say that we are seeing that there is a lot of crisis beyond what is happening in Senegal at the moment. How do we look at that in a holistic way in terms of responding to crisis and ensuring that their diaspora is resourcing and also mobilizing efforts beyond what we are doing here in Africa. And to Professor, I'm very much interested in the diaspora remittances, but how do we feed into those remittances to support social movements and feminist movements in Africa, looking at the crises and the multiple crises that we are also seeing, especially this year? Thank you.
One last question.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. I am Abdoulaye Diallo. I work at the African Human Rights Organization, RADO, in charge of research and knowledge management. I have two questions to my elder here. Philanthropy. African philanthropy, can it be a source of funding for civil society, African civil society organizations? Second question, as you rightly said, Senegal has a legal framework with regard to Waqf, but have we put in place the actions for Islam, for religious brotherhoods rather, Muridism, Tijanism, and Hadriya? Have we looked at the philanthropic actions that they are conducting in our countries? Thank you.
I'll have the panelists, you have 2 minutes to respond to each question.
Who starts?
Okay. Merci.
Thank you. Now, with regard to the question about foundations, I believe that most of our organizations have made a choice at a certain point in time that is dictated by the laws and their vision, as well as the ecosystem. Most of the organizations that come to work here, when they talk to us and they consult us, to become an international association for those coming from abroad, an NGO or a foundation. Each status has an advantage and its disadvantages as well. Now, with regard to foundations, for the government, it is more interesting to have more NGOs than foundations, because they cannot control the foundations as much, because since we are organizations that are under the Ministry of the Interior, we know very well that that is for us to be controlled even more, for them to oversee us, because we are NGOs, therefore we're under the Ministry of the Interior. Now, I think we need to have in-depth reflections with regard to organizations that have more the vision and the spirit of a foundation. But there also, we know that when it is a foundation, we have to look at what type of foundation it is. There are different types of foundations of public interest, with for whom the government requests that the state is represented in the board of directors. That is also a problem, because the vision, it can affect the vision of the foundation. The state can influence it. It's a pity that in the spirit of the government, they are not in generous philanthropy. They are more in thinking about something else. And maybe if we had time, we could have defined that something else. The stance of this government and officials in general with regard to the relationship they have with organizations. That is what we have to look at in order to have status that is more favorable or more adapted for the types of organizations that you are talking about, or even these religious organizations that you certainly listen to over the past few days. Even for Touba Kanam, we had to have reflection to find out what would be the best type of status for that, whether it was a foundation or depending on the advantages and disadvantages of the various types of status. This allows me to respond to the second question. Yes. All of these organizations that are being created within these religious brotherhoods in Senegal, Medina Bay, Touba Kanam, all of these brotherhoods, they all have these types of organizations with the objective of mobilizing resources and investing in the cities where these brotherhoods are based or elsewhere in Senegal. And these organizations need, and that is why I try to facilitate the link between this meeting and some of these organizations, because they also need to listen to the scientific scholars, other stakeholders, in order to improve their theories, to improve their presentations and their own vision. And I think we also need, from the other side, at the level of the governments, a reflection on these types of organizations and how the government can help them to ensure that their work is promoted. Let me remind you that for Touba Kanam, it's a 10 billion CFA budget, and it has a high mobilizing capacity in Touba. So these are reflections that we need to have at the national level. Thank you.
1 minute, okay. I'm not good with brevity, so Atieno, please interrupt me. I'll answer your question in two ways, with the two hats I wear. I think, first of all, funding research is essential because so many of these crises don't just pop out of the blue, right? There are historical factors, there are necessarily long views that we need to take on how these crises develop, how they come back again and again over time, and how they shift over time. And so first and foremost, I will make a shameless plug for the importance of academic research that is not beholden to anything beyond trying to understand causes of violence or whatever the issue may be. I think on trying to be brief, on the second point, I'll switch hats and I'll talk sort of as the co-founder of Global Black Youth, right? I think what we've seen is that essentially there are the historic divides, the colonial divides, the linguistic divides, that really separate Black people and people of African descent from around the world, right? So Global Black Youth joins, the legacies and the ongoing Pan-African movements to showcase the challenges and also the wins and successes of what Black people globally, and especially Black youth globally, are able to do when they mobilize their resources, their knowledge, right? Their talent, their time, I'm forgetting the third T, their treasure, together, right? And so what we try to do is look at not only what is happening and what is being mobilized in the global south, but looking at the global south and the global north, right? And remembering that our brothers and sisters in so much of the so-called developed world are facing similar challenges because of the color of their skin, because of their ethnicity, right? As our illustrious speaker said this morning, we're not a global minority, we're a global majority. So how do we begin to set global agendas together in a multi-sectoral and multi-disciplinary way? And so those are sort of the two hats I wear. And when we think about these ongoing crises that are happening everywhere, that's really two of the ways that I would look at it, both looking at research and trying to look at the histories, and two, looking at how we're setting goals and agendas together in a global way.
Yes. The diaspora are always the first responders. And this is known when there's a crisis anywhere, the money transfer companies reported, there would be spikes before governments or Red Cross are able to initiate stuff. Money is coming in, first responders. That's family members. Then the next amongst the diaspora are hometown associations. So this methodology is what eventually led to the framework now of diaspora development funds, because it developed in Mexico, where you then saw the hometown association sending money. Then you would have the municipality that's affected put in some money and resources. Then the state would put in some money. Then the federal government would put in some money. Then outsiders, in the case of Mexico, it was Western Union Foundation would put in some money. So this became the 1+ methodology, which has evolved into the Diaspora Development Fund. So it offers a good methodology where the first respondents, the diaspora, would then be accompanied by all the other partners to address the local matter. So that may be a good vehicle. On the question on the bonds and what to do with remittances, given the time, I'll just give a brief outline and have the conversation further with our colleague. There's 2 main proposals that have emerged out of the studies. One is the innovative finance mechanism, which we're calling remit aid. That is, since the migrants in France, before they send money to Senegal, have already paid tax on it. And since what they are sending it for in Senegal very likely ticks the box of the SDGs, then it is entitled to some sort of tax relief. Because if they gave it to a charity, they would have received tax relief. So the idea is that tax relief, we can call it match funding. And instead of it being given personally to the migrant, it is given to a common pool. That common pool aggregates the money. And that big sum, which can run into billions of pounds of dollars a year, will be an endowment fund. So maybe 20% of it can be spent, 80% would be endowed in Africa. Then the endowment body would invest it through ethical impact investors in Africa. And then the income, the earning from that is what goes back and is disbursed. In summary, that is it, although there's other elements of money to come in. The second and last proposal is about the diaspora bonds. We hear a lot. If you look at the literature, there's talk of diaspora bonds. In reality, there's far more talk than action. There's only 4 successful diaspora bonds in the history of Africa. Yeah? Sorry, 1 successful, 3 failures, 4 attempts, hundreds of talks, several plans, 4 attempts, 1 success. Yeah? Ghana 2007, Kenya I think 2000, sorry, Ghana 2007, Kenya I think 2012, Ethiopia. The only one that was successful is Nigeria, 2017, and they finished it last year, July. That's when it was redeemed. Now what we have proposed is, instead of a global or Euro bond, which has to be issued in New York or London, we should do a diaspora-targeted bond, whereby it is on the local bond structure, and all African governments are well experienced. And there's a myth that African governments should not be trusted with loans. No, we should trust them. They never default. Never. In fact, that's not a good story, because sometimes they would cut social services rather than default. Yeah? But they never default, they know the bond structure. So what we propose is diaspora targeted bonds. So take those bonds, market it particularly to the diaspora, but not for it to go to the general treasury of the Ministry of Finance, but for it to go to specific projects. Let it have a short life of 3 to 5 years, and the income, the earnings would be local currency. And the diaspora will still send their hard currency to invest. that would be refunded in hard currency, but their earnings in local currency, they need it because they have local currency expenses. Roughly, that's the idea of the diaspora targeted bond. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to this esteemed panel. You are now free to leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much.